I have attended the Aldersham Concert Hall's donor preview evenings for going on 19 years, and in all that time I cannot say I paid much attention to the man who kept the place clean. His name was Thomas Vale, printed on a laminated badge pinned to his gray work coat, the kind of badge that signals a person the room is meant to look through, rather than at. He was 68, slight, with close-cropped white hair, and the unhurried movements of a man who has made peace with every corner of the place he tends. Each preview evening, while the patrons gathered in the stalls, Thomas would work the edges of the stage with his wide mop, tidying around the orchestra chairs with a practiced quiet that bordered on invisible. He always gave a nod if you caught his eye. He never intruded. For 19 years, he had been as much a part of the Aldersham as the chandeliers or the smell of old lacquered wood. The evening in question was a Thursday in late October. 20 of us had been invited, the hall's principal donors, to sit in the front stalls while the Meridian Chamber Orchestra ran through the program before Saturday's public concert. It was a privilege we took seriously, arriving in good dress, speaking in murmurs, as though the concert had already begun. Maestro Aldrich Sohn was on the podium, a man of 50-something with an imperious carriage and the confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own ear. He was, by any account, a gifted conductor. He was also the sort of man who managed the room as carefully as he managed the orchestra, always aware of who was watching, always performing, even between pieces. The Steinway Concert Grand sat at the front of the stage, lid raised, catching the light. It was not part of that evening's program. The concert was chamber music, strings and winds, but it stood there as it always did, a presence in itself. As the musicians finished their warm-up and the players shifted in their chairs, Thomas came in from the wings with his mop to make a final pass across the downstage boards. He worked efficiently, as he always did, but as he drew level with the piano, he stopped for just a moment. It was nothing more than that, a pause, a glance at the keys. The way a man might glance at an old photograph hanging in a hallway. Maestro Sohn saw it. Vale. His voice cut across the hall cleanly, carrying the practiced projection of a man used to being heard over an orchestra. The musicians looked up. The patrons in the stalls, myself among them, turned. Thomas turned, mop in hand. That instrument, the maestro said, and his tone was the particular blend of command and amusement that puts a person in their place, without raising a shout, is not to be touched by maintenance staff. Are we clear on that? Thomas said nothing. He gave a small nod and shifted to continue his work. But the maestro had an audience, and an audience emboldens a certain kind of man. Tell me, Vale, how long have you been mopping around that piano? He gestured toward the Steinway with his baton. A few of the musicians exchanged glances. One of the younger patrons near me gave a small, uncertain smile. Thomas considered the question plainly. Going on 31 years, sir. 31 years. Son let that land with a little flourish of incredulity, turning slightly toward the stalls as though inviting us all to appreciate the absurdity. And in 31 years of proximity to a concert grand, I imagine you've formed some opinions. He smiled then, the kind of smile that frames what comes next as a joke with only one intended victim. Go on then, since you've been studying it so carefully. Show us what 31 years of Ping has taught you. The word show landed with a particular weight. It was not an invitation. It was a dare dressed as one, issued in front of 20 patrons and 16 musicians, designed to produce a moment of embarrassment and be done with it. The room held its breath, waiting for the person to redden and decline. Thomas did not redden. He set his mop against the wing wall with the same unhurried care with which he did everything. He walked to the piano bench, pulled it out precisely, and sat down. He rolled back the cuffs of his gray work coat one turn each. He placed his hands in his lap for a moment, not dramatically but simply, the way a man settles himself before something that matters. Then he put his hands on the keys. What he played was Schumann. Träumerei, Dreaming, the seventh piece from the Kinderscenen, a work of such unassuming tenderness that it can sound, in lesser hands, like nothing more than a gentle exercise. In Thomas Vale's hands it was something else entirely. The first phrase came out of the instrument so softly that I was not certain, for a fraction of a second, that I had heard it. Then it came again, shaped with the kind of subtle weight that does not announce itself, but simply arrives, like light changing in a room. The melody moved the way a held thought moves, unhurried, certain, full of something that could not quite be named. He played with his eyes closed, his back straight but not stiff, and there was nothing in his posture of performance or display. He was simply playing the way one breathes, because it was the most natural thing in the world for him to do. To my left, one of the patrons stopped speaking mid-sentence. To my right, another set down her program on her knee without looking away from the stage. In the orchestra, the first violinist had been tuning a peg. Her hand stilled. The cellist, who had been leaning to speak with his stand partner, straightened slowly and turned to face the piano. One by one, with a quiet I have never before witnessed among assembled musicians, they all turned. They did not put their instruments down. They simply stopped, mid-motion, as though the music had reached each of them in turn and gently said, "Wait." The maestro had taken a step back from the podium. He stood with his baton at his side. The piece is not long. 4 minutes, perhaps. When played at the tempo it asks for, which is not slow, exactly, but deeply patient, each phrase allowed its full measure of breath. Thomas gave it that. He gave it everything it asked for, including the places where the melody dips into a minor shadow and then lifts back into the light, and those passages held a particular ache, a grown sorrow worn smooth with time. When the final phrase came, he shaped it with the same plainness with which he had shaped the first. No added weight, no farewell gesture, and the last chord faded into the hall, the way the last light fades from a room when the sun is finally gone. He lifted his hands from the keys. The Aldersham concert hall held the silence for a moment that felt longer than it was. Not the silence of indifference, and not the charged silence of a crowd, drawing breath for applause. It was something quieter than either of those. The silence of 20 people and 16 musicians who had just understood, together, that they had been wrong about something, and that the being wrong had been a gift. Nobody spoke. Thomas rolled his cuffs back down. He rose from the bench, pushed it in, and walked back to where his mop stood against the wall. He collected it without hurry. Before he moved into the wings, he glanced back at the piano once more. The same glance as before, the same brief look at an old familiar thing, and then he was gone. I turned at some point to look at Maestro Son. He was still standing where he had been. The baton was down. He was looking at the doorway through which Thomas had vanished, and whatever expression had been on his face when he issued his little dare was no longer there. Something had replaced it that I had not seen on the man before. It looked, if I am honest, like the beginning of humility. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he turned back to the orchestra, raised his baton, and tapped the stand quietly. The musicians arranged themselves. The rehearsal resumed. I have thought about that evening many times in the years since, about what it means to carry a thing like that. 31 years of cleaning the house of the music you love, close enough to touch and never touching, until the one night someone hands you the door by way of a joke. About Thomas Vale's hands on those keys, and the sound of 16 musicians going still, and the particular quality of the silence that filled the Aldersham when the last note left it. There are people who live their whole lives a few feet from the thing they were made for. Most of them never sit down. Thomas Vale sat down once, and played the way water finds its level. Not as though he were proving something, but as though there had never been any question at all. The hall changed management the following spring. When I returned for the autumn season, a different face was mopping the wings. I never learned where Thomas Vale went, or whether anyone ever again invited him to the bench. But I remember the music. On the nights when the hall is still and the Steinway sits with its lid raised, I remember every note, and I am glad, deeply glad, that I was in the front row the night a janitor showed a conductor what 31 years of listening looks like when it finally finds a voice.